By the time of the Yalta Conference in February of 1945 and the Potsdam Conference of July of 1945, it was pretty clear that the United States and the Soviet Union were no longer seeking the same objectives around the world, and that they would compete politically, economically, militarily, and strategically with each other. This competition was known as the Cold War. They wouldn't actually go to war with each other, that's why it was cold, but they would find ways to push each other just a little bit to seek advantage. This theory of the Cold War was articulated first by this man right here. His name is George Kennan, and he is famous for sending the long telegram, and that outlined the case that the United States should actively resist Soviet and communist acts of aggression around the world, and he believed every time the Soviet Union would try to expand their territory, and if the United States stood up to them, the United States would win every time. He thought the Soviet Union was not as strong as they seemed, and that they would back down every time. The other part of the Cold War is the polarization aspect. Both sides thought the other side was evil. Winston Churchill definitely thought the Soviet Union was evil. He gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946, which was called the Iron Curtain Speech, which basically said that anyone living in the countries under the Soviet zone of influence was living under an iron-fisted government, an evil empire, so to speak. The other part was giving countries money to support your goals. That's what the Truman Doctrine was. The Truman Doctrine was thought up by President Harry S. Truman, and it said that the United States would provide financial, economic, military, and political aid to any country that was trying to resist communist forces anywhere in the world. Another thing the United States did was to implement what was called the Marshall Plan. It was named after George C. Marshall. He was the Secretary of State for the United States at the time, and he enacted the Marshall Plan, and it was a massive American financial aid program to the countries in Western Europe that were extremely devastated by the war, and their economies were not doing very well, and communism is very popular during hard economic times. So the idea was to dump a whole bunch of American money in Western Europe to make democracy and capitalism thrive once again. And it worked very well. And it did so well that it threatened the Soviet Union a little bit. So their idea to get back at the United States and the Western powers, and Western Germany in particular, was to try to seize all of Berlin. Half of Berlin was under the control of the Western democracies. We have France, Britain, and the United States, and the other half was the Soviets. So the Soviets were going to their plan was to surround Berlin, don't let any food or anything in, and then eventually they would give up. The Soviet Union would have all of Berlin, and then they would have that small victory. What did the United States do instead? They flew in food for a year, and eventually the Soviet Union gave up, and Berlin was saved. And this was just a small example of how a divided Germany was exploited by both the United States and the Soviet Union for small competitions in the global Cold War sport that was going on. A major escalation of the Cold War was the creation of military alliances. The United States created, or was in large part responsible for, the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Those are the countries in yellow. The main reason for the creation of NATO, as it was said by one of its officials, was to keep the United States in, the Soviet Union out, and Germany down. In reaction to the creation of NATO, the Soviet Union created their own military alliance, and it was called the Warsaw Pact. And that included countries like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc., etc. Europe was just one arena in which the Cold War was being waged between the Soviet Union and the United States. The main battleground that we're going to focus on is in Asia. Before, during, and after the Second World War, China was involved in a major and brutal civil war between the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists led by Mao Zedong. Eventually, Mao Zedong won. The communists won, and they declared that all of this area here was going to be called the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek took his nationalist group and fled across to Taiwan and created what they called was China, but they call it the Republic of China. So you have two groups both claiming to represent China, and at the United Nations this gets very complicated. And so it was, for whatever reason, it was decided that the Republic of China here in Taiwan would represent China in their one seat at the United Nations. Now, why is this important for our story about the Korean War? Well, the reason is once the Japanese were defeated and they were kicked out of Korea, the Soviet Union took over the northern half and put in place a person that they thought would advance their economic and political goals, and the United States did the same thing in the south. So the Soviet Union put in place Kim Il Sung, and the Americans put in place Syngman Rhee, and they both really wanted to conquer the other Korea. So they had a small war going on, and they needed help from superpowers in order to advance their own goals. That is another theme of the Cold War: is small wars getting big because superpowers get involved. So he had the United States backing him up, and Kim Il Sung had the Soviet Union. But he also had China. There's a very interesting dynamic going on between Stalin and Mao Zedong. Stalin kind of gave Mao a free hand to deal with and to help North Korea conquer the South, but only if it meant not having full-out war with the United States. So Mao gave permission to Kim Il Sung that he could invade the South. And he did so in 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and nearly conquered all of Korea. So South Korea obviously is screaming for help. So where do they go for help? They ask the United Nations. So the United Nations was not necessarily a productive place to be because of the veto system that would go on the Security Council. The Soviet Union could vote down any declaration of war or whatever that the United Nations might have. But there is very much a power struggle going on with who could represent China, as we mentioned before. And so at the time, the Soviet Union was actually boycotting the United Nations in protest of the People's Republic of China not being allowed to represent China. And taking advantage of this, while the Soviets were gone, the United States pushed through a resolution in the United Nations ordering North Korea to leave the South, or the United Nations would remove them by force. So a United Nations army comprised mainly of Americans, but had a lot of Canadians as well, would remove them. They didn't actually call it a war, they called it a police action. President Truman did not want it to be called a war because a war sounds too provocative, and he didn't want to rock the boat too much as to threaten Mao too much or to threaten Stalin too much into fighting a big war. The United Nations force that would push back North Korean forces was going to be led by Douglas MacArthur. He was an old World War II general in the Pacific, and it was his job to lead UN forces. And his main idea was to break out of the Pusan pocket by going around and doing a D-Day style landing at Incheon here, and he would catch the North Koreans from behind, and it was extremely successful. In fact, it was so successful, he was able to push North Korean forces nearly back to the Chinese border. Now, you got to be wondering at this time, how is Mao feeling about this? Mao is extremely nervous. He did not like it, and so in fact, he invaded into North Korea and pushed American forces back a lot, nearly back to the 38th parallel. So this is a major, major escalation. So you've got to be thinking that Stalin is getting nervous about this too, because he's kind of created this mess, and or he's allowed this mess to happen, and now he might have to clean it up. Both Mao and Stalin were both communists, and they were extremely brutal to their own people. But by 1950, China was not as strong as the Soviet Union, and they still relied heavily on the Soviet Union for support. So Mao needed to ask Stalin's permission for most things, and Stalin was pretty much still the top dog in the communist world. But China kind of wanted to show how good they were doing as well. So the war eventually was not going as well for the Americans. As we said, the Americans were pushed back as far as the 38th parallel, and things weren't going well. And so MacArthur here, in order to kind of push the Chinese back, wanted to use nuclear weapons. He wanted to throw a couple nukes at them. Harry S. Truman, again being cautious, didn't want that. And so him and MacArthur had a very public argument about how the war would be waged. And eventually, MacArthur lost. He was fired. Truman fired MacArthur, and he replaced him with this man here. His name was Thomas Ridgway. So the war kind of dragged on for the next 2 years, and similar to the First World War, after a period of rapid movements and sweeping military maneuvers, the Korean War became a stalemate. And there was not much a stomach for a big war anymore. Neither side wanted to escalate the conflict to make anything bigger. They were kind of just happy the way things were. And the boundaries between North and South Korea did not change all that much as a result of the war. As you can see here, the 38th parallel is pretty much where the line of occupation was anyways. So how do you describe the American action in the war? The Americans got involved in what was called a police action to preserve, the capitalistic and democratic South Korea from communist aggression. They did not want to escalate the war for fear of a major conflict with the Soviet Union. And they did not want a World War III over Korea. Most Americans at the time could not locate Korea on a map. They could understand going to war in Europe, but certainly not in a small country in Asia. China's participation in the Korean War was a little bit more complicated. Mao wanted to assert himself on the world stage. After all, he had just taken control of China, and he wanted to show how the People's Republic could really do. And he finally wanted the involvement to show that they still had that China was a force to be reckoned with, and it displayed themselves as being the true defender of communism in Asia. So at this point, a small rivalry begins with the Soviet Union, and he saw Stalin as somewhat of a pussycat that was really afraid to confront the West. Mao had confronted them head on. And finally, the Soviet participation, they did not want to get too involved militarily because they did not want to fight a World War III over Korea as well. And especially after World War II, Stalin became very cautious. He wanted to expand Soviet influence, but only if it meant not frightening the United States into war. The Soviets were well aware that appeasement was not a popular policy at all. And Munich was only 12 years previous to this. So by having appeasement there, he knew that the United States would maybe go to war a lot as a result of that.